How did a religion which began in the Middle East with a group of fallible fishermen end up, in the eyes of over 1 billion Christians at least, being centered in Italy around one infallible man? I'm talking, of course, about the Pope, and how we got the papacy is a very strange tale, and it begins in the very early church. If you remember from the previous video, see a link in the description below, leadership in the early church was chaotic at best once the original apostles started dying off. The New Testament wasn't organized yet, and the Old wasn't even fully accepted by many believers. Books were being passed around claiming to be written by apostles that were, quite frankly, insane, and the church needed a way to fact check. And the only thing they had was to ask people who had been trained by an apostle, and to trust that those people would not distort the teachings they had received. This became known as apostolic succession, the idea that truth gets handed down, and without that pedigree, someone's teaching was suspect. Now, this happened quite early. Possibly the earliest known Christian letter outside of the New Testament came from Clement, the Bishop of Rome, writing about 95 CE. He wrote to the church in Corinth because they had ditched the apostolic leaders. Clement wrote to them and told them that they needed to get those leaders back, because otherwise the church would lose the thread of truth. Before there was the Bible, there was oral tradition, and these disciples of the apostles were the guardians of that tradition. That's all they had. So the closer a church and its leader were to a disciple, then the more likely they were seen to have answers. Rather quickly, smaller churches without that history of apostles leading them began turning to more established churches in the area. Cities like Jerusalem, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and more all became important churches that people looked to for help and advice, because they were established by apostles. But it wasn't them forcing themselves on others. It was more like how Willow Creek or Saddleback or North Point churches in America have established networks of churches that look to them for ideas and guidance. No power seeking, it's just many other churches naturally turn to them to learn because they seem to be doing well. They seem to know what's going on, so let's listen. And this created a network of leadership in the larger churches between the bishops of these more established cities, where the bishops shared governance of the church. Now, in the East, any number of churches could claim to be started by an apostle, but in the West, only Rome really had that honor, having been founded by Peter. This would be fine because the population was all in the East as well, but the Roman Empire at this time was splitting apart at the seams. The eastern half spoke Greek, the West spoke Latin, and they didn't really talk much because of it. The two sides of the empire and the church were moving apart because they only talked within their own spheres to people who spoke their own language. In 285, the divisions had gotten bad enough that the Emperor Diocletian split the empire in half, though the church, in theory at least, did remain united. In practice, however, it left Rome as the only real church authority in the entire West. And as the Western Roman Empire fell apart, the Bishop of Rome worked hard to hold it all together and took on much of the responsibilities that should have been the emperor's. When Rome was attacked by marauders, for instance, it was the Bishop of Rome who bribed them to leave. The Roman Senate was long gone. The Eastern and Western Roman churches stayed together for centuries after this, until 1054 in fact, but they drifted apart. When the East looked west, they saw one church, Rome, usurping authority that should have been held by many and trying to rule over everyone. But when the West looked east, they saw the Eastern Emperor ruling over the church, and the church as a lapdog to imperial power. Both sides thought the other was missing the point. By the time 800 CE rolled around, the different sides of the church were barely acknowledging each other. Their practices and theology had diverged over hundreds of years of speaking different languages. So it was an easy step for the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to say that the church had the power to control the state. And he did so by blessing the upstart Charlemagne as the new Holy Roman Emperor, cementing the Pope as authority over the nations of Europe. And this remained unchallenged until the Reformation. But even so, it would be centuries before the belief in the Pope's infallibility actually became doctrine. That had to wait until 1870, when a Roman Catholic council made it official in order to combat the arguments of Protestants and new scholarship, which had undermined so much of the Roman Catholic Church's authority for centuries. I do not agree with the papacy, but coming to see how each step of power came about made me view it a lot more charitably. Because while there were power grabs over the centuries, for the most part, each step came naturally from the one before it, from necessity, not from greed, as they tried to hold together the West. I hope you enjoyed this look at how the Pope came to be. Next week is a look at some of those theological arguments that drove the East and the West apart, in particular the debates about how Jesus came to be seen as God. I hope you'll join in for it. But until then, thank you for watching. Have a great week. See you next Friday.